Good morning and welcome to today's program. I'm Jessica Ashton here on behalf of the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, Canyon City, Colorado, and we are coming to you from City Hall. It is August 12th, 2023, and today's genealogy program is an interesting topic for our area. Off to the Hoosegow. Terry's going to teach us about researching genealogy as it pertains to jail records. So here in Canyon City, we have the territorial prison was established before Colorado was even a state, 1871. So our community has a rich history with prisons. So I'll be interested to see what we learned today. So Terri, thank you.
Good morning and welcome to Off to the Hoosegow. We'll just dive right in. Have you found someone in doing some of your census research that might have been involved in one way or another with the criminal justice system? On this first slide, we see Mr. Tall, and fortunately, he's on the right side of the law as the jailer serving in the county jail. But we're going to look at those that might have been on the other side today. As we see, it's not anything new. We find that poor Mr. Ott has a son, William, who's only 16, and he's already in jail for murder, awaiting trial. And this one is actually from the 1870 census. Mr. Bond in 1860 is in jail for larceny. And in 1850, it's Mrs. Cummins who's in jail for drunkenness. We also find newspaper articles. And apparently, this editor ran afoul of some of his constituents and printed an article critical of the investigation of a crime. And the marshal actually took exception to that article and filed contempt charges. And the editor was fined $50 and ordered to spend 10 days in jail. So when we see that somebody is on the wrong side of the law, we also see sometimes that people are doing things that they believe are correct and right. But they unfortunately have to wait for laws to change. Here is an article from 1917 for Miss Lucy Branham, and she was the winner of the Carnegie Hero Medal and the organizer of the Just Government League, and she has been arrested in a suffrage march and is sentenced to 60 days in the workhouse. So let's take a little history walk to see the development of the various kinds of correctional institutions. First, we're going to divide them into the three types of institutions that exist today: jails, state prisons, and federal prisons. Jails were usually the local facilities, and they were designed for short-term sentences. They were either holding people for trial, or if they had committed a minor crime, for example, drunkenness, they might be sentenced to 10 days or a short period of time. And they were usually run by the cities or the counties. Whereas state prisons and federal prisons eventually were designed for much longer term sentences, and specifically dividing them out to state crimes versus federal crimes. And we have to realize that each state had different laws and that sentences might have varied greatly between those states. And the degree of the crime also might have varied according to the different state laws. Jails have been around from the beginning of the colonies. It was interesting to find out that even as early as 1606, Jamestown, Virginia had a jail. Massachusetts came up with its jail in Boston in 1635, and Maryland followed in 1662. So they have been around for a long period of time. However, most of the English colonies brought the criminal justice system that was in existence in England. And as we mentioned, the jails were for those that were waiting trial or as a form of punishment. However, the jails were not what we think of today. In many, many cases, just like our cover picture showed, they were more similar to a cage or a simple closet. They didn't use long-term incarceration for punishment. One of the major reasons was that they believed that capital punishment was a more significant deterrent to crime. And we also see that some of the states developed workhouses. People might have been in county jails for a short period of time, but then they were sentenced to a little bit longer period of service in a workhouse. And here again, it depended on the type of crime that they might have committed. Thinking about the jailers themselves, in many cases, jails were simply similar to homes. The jailers lived in an apartment or in a room attached to the jail. And frequently, their family also lived with them. The inmates initially rented their bed. Nothing was provided in the jail. Your family was the one that had to bring your food and provide your necessities. And in time, the jailers then rented the beds to the prisoners, and they also provided the meals and necessities in exchange for pay. There were at the time few statutes that defined what the jailer's duties were as far as, and what their responsibilities were as far as caring for the prisoners. In many cases, prisoners were just left kind of to fend for themselves. So what were the types of punishment that existed in colonial and early times? As I mentioned, the primary form of punishment was capital punishment. For something even as simple as public drunkenness, you might have been hanged or executed in some way, shape, or form. Many were pardoned if it was their first offense, but if they were habitual offenders, they faced the gallows. And over time, we see that corporal punishment was softened and it turned more to humiliation. We have seen pictures from the colonies where people are put in the stocks or they're publicly flogged or whipped. And in some cases, in many cases, like women might have been banished from the colony to fend for themselves. We saw where the Boston jail got started in 1635, and thanks to Wikipedia, we see who some of these illustrious prisoners might have been in the early times. It's interesting to look at the 17th century and see those that might have been Quakers or accused of being witches, to see how they wound up in jail. I found it interesting that at the bottom of that list, we see Captain John Alden, which is a name that many of us are very familiar with, as well as that of William Kidd. And I actually investigated to see what their crimes might have been. And John Alden was indeed charged with witchcraft. He was tried and convicted, jailed, and he managed to escape. And during his escape, they didn't know where he had gone, but apparently he had returned to his hometown and was hidden there for approximately a year and was eventually cleared by a proclamation. William Kidd, the infamous quote unquote pirate, was originally hired to track down and capture pirates, but he was eventually arrested for piracy, and he in 1701 was actually hanged for that crime. Fortunately, there was progress made, and by the 18th century, we are seeing fines being levied, in combination with corporal punishment. Prisoners that did not have family support were allowed to beg in order to pay the jailers. And we find that work was limited in its scope. They spent long hours in idleness. Jail keepers were not originally paid a salary, but indeed made their money from the sale of the food and those essentials that the prisoners needed. Eventually, the jailers, their fees were fixed and they did receive quote unquote salaries. During this time, jail construction methods were standardized. So we see the more permanent structures and the interiors with cells that we have come to know today. So what got people, what were some of the things where they ran afoul of the law? Here is a case, a sheriff's sale. And we're looking not only at those that might have been guilty, but we're also looking at those that are involved in the criminal justice system as well. So if you have an ancestor that did not fall afoul of the law, but worked on the criminal justice side, some of these cases might prove very interesting to you as well. Here we find that Mr. and Mrs. Johnson probably have failed to pay their taxes. So their property is being foreclosed upon in a sheriff's sale. They apparently owe $1,268.20. And a Mr. Backwell is going to try to purchase their land. This is in 1878, and the property had originally been sold to them. We see a description of the property, and in the sale, we see that Mr. Backwell has paid $1,000 for the land, but the Johnsons still owe $268 towards the estate or the sheriff. We also see the listing of the kinds of things that were involved in the sheriff and court system. We see how the complaints are lodged, instructions. We see various sets of information on our leftmost column, and we see what is expected in the right. And we get the days where these various motions have been entered and received into the court system. On the second page, we also see that for each one of those entries, there are indeed fees that were charged and what those fees covered. We also see towards the bottom by cash that a payment was actually made. So you can see how people involved in the court system on both sides either received or were charged various sums. And don't forget, there are court cases behind many of these records. Wanted posters. Look for those wanted posters, not only if you have someone on the wrong side of the law, but who is issuing that warrant for their arrest. Who are the people? What is the county where these people might have been sought? And of course, what is the crime that they have been charged with? Are they guilty or are they innocent? We have warrant and process servers as well in the system. And we see in this particular case that Mr. Austin is being charged with embezzlement. We see who has lodged the complaint, the name of the officer involved who has served the arrest warrant. We see the justice of the peace, his name, as well as the township that they are in. And he was released on his own recognizance by the judge. We can also find some lists of prisoners, and it was interesting to see also that detained witnesses, while this does not specifically list out any detained witnesses, if there was a chance that a witness to a crime might try to avoid testifying, they too might have been detained. This listing comes from early 1900, and we see the names of the prisoners, what their offense is, by whom they were committed, and the date of their commitment, which in some cases may be a month or two afterwards. Going further, we see their term of detention. And in the case of the first two gentlemen who were insane, they have been sent to an insane asylum. Others have been charged with various terms of detention and will be spending those terms in jail and then might be released or fined. I must note that there were very few of these records via ancestry or family search. two of the more popular sites that we seek out. However, these records do exist in state archives, local archives. We have some of these records in the Royal Gorge Regional Museum and History Center, and also in prison museums, you might find some of these records. They may not be easily discovered online, but they are available. Here again, we have another jail register with the people's names, their ages, a physical description as far as how tall they are, the color of their hair and their eyes, and what their complexion is. The nativity of each person. So this is Washington State, where these people are being interred, but we see that they came from Canada, Michigan, England, Kansas. So people did travel. People migrated across the country. And we see what their sentence was, whether it was bail or an actual time period. Continuing on across, we see where their crimes were committed, what the actual crime was, the date that they actually left prison, and why they were released to someone for parole, or they were released as a result of paying bail. And we notice that for the most part, these sentences, it's a jail, are very short. Here is yet another example of what the complaint actually was against the people, and was the who the booking officer was, and was the complaint served. We see the date that it was issued and the date that it was actually received. And in several cases, I saw where the warrants were not actually served, that they could not find the person. We noticed in the case of Mabel that she went by several aliases. And we see the charges against her and where exactly they were. Here's another one from California that is much later. This one, I believe, is 1957. And in this particular case, they're noting the actual statutes rather than seeing the actual terms of larceny, burglary, assault, etc. We see the violation of we see the statute numbers. So that would take further research. Number one, you would have to look at the given time period and then look for the statutes for that specific time period. Statutes continually change. And we get a complete register of not only their names, but who the judges are, what their terms of confinement are, and whether they actually serve that time, pay a fine, etc. Prisons. They were designated for long-term punishment, and they were for more serious crimes. For the most part, people were confined for at least more than a year. Prisons were actually looked upon as being more humane than jail, which I found interesting. And here again, we see very, very early on where long-term prisons were established in the 1700s. So Massachusetts had the first prison. Newgate Prison in Connecticut was the first state prison, and other states followed. They realized that punishment didn't deter crimes. The jail conditions were deplorable, and that long-term confinement and separation from the family, they hoped would convince the prisoners never to commit another crime. However, that didn't work. At some point, prisons became penitentiaries with the idea that people would repent for their wrongdoing. The idea was that they wanted to remove people from a bad environment. They wanted to introduce rehabilitation, perhaps training, so that they could go out back into the community and be productive adults within that community. Surprisingly, sentences were typically only a couple of years. There were very, very few long sentences. And I found in looking at some of these records that even some of the long sentences were commuted or pardoned after what to me were very short periods of time. And in looking at these records and finding pages and pages of people that were sentenced to jails or prisons, I wondered, was there anyone who lived according to the law? So early on, there were no life sentences. They kept them short, hoping that the prisoners would indeed become reformed. And we see that some of the longer sentences might have been in the 8 to 12-year range. Oops. Living here in Canyon City, it was easy to find a 1920 census for the actual prison here and the listing of the inmates who were in prison. Here again, we turn to newspaper articles and see who is in jail or who is being sent or who is going on trial to see if they are going to be sent to prison. And this is a case where a doctor did some questionable things, whereas the father was already serving in the penitentiary for violating his daughter. If you are interested in state prisons, this is a map showing each of the states and the actual colored dots within the states. The dark blue, for example, that we see in Texas indicates the number of state prisons that each state has. The lighter blue is the smallest of the numbers. And I believe that Texas has like 35 or more state prisons, whereas like Utah only has between 1 and 5. So, and then from there, you can get actual listings of the various state prisons and what their inmate capacity is. Today, whether those capacities have been overrun or challenged may prove interesting. But we do see the levels of correctional facilities within each state. This might also help you narrow down if you do have a person that might have served time in a prison. The court case will actually tell you the information. So here we go back to 1858 in New Hampshire. And we get the name, the age of the prisoner, where they were born, when they were convicted, what their crime was, the date of their actual commitment, their sentence, and when they were discharged, and are there any remarks? Some prisons also kept conduct registers. I know that the territorial prison here took in Canyon City, conducted conduct registers. And in both of the cases that I have pulled here, one was actually killed and the other one died, killed in trying to escape. So, but good behavior as well as bad behavior was noted. Here is a record for a woman in Chambers County, Alabama. And we get a description of a physical description of her, where she was from, and what her crime was. And she assisted in a murder. And she's only given approximately a 2-year sentence. So she's convicted in 1898, and she's actually let go in 1899. It was interesting to me that there was a completely separate register at this particular New York prison for those that were foreign born. So here again, we see their names. I want to get these correct. Their nativity, the date that they arrived in the United States, whether or not they were citizens, and in most cases they were not, what their literacy was. Could they read and write? And one of the questions I had was, could they read and write English? Or could they simply read and write in their native tongue? What trade they might have been engaged in, and whether they were employed or idle. What their crime was, what their sentence was, whether they were married or single, and a whole set of information on whether they were previously convicted. And seeing that this was in the beginning of like the 1900s, and seeing that within a very, very short period of time, these people had some form of previous incarceration or jailing was very interesting. The immigrants' lot must have been indeed very difficult. They also have records for the inmates as they have been received, when they are actually entering the prison. And we get their names, their crimes, the sentences, and this time we get actually the court that they were tried in as well as the judge that presided. Did they have an occupation? What their age was? Again, a physical description of height and weight. Their literacy. Can they read and write? And did they have any aliases? Were they going by a different name? Were they in a former state prison? The dates that they might have been there, their nativity, whether from the States or whether from a foreign country, and a former county prison. So we're looking at both county prisons and state prisons, and when they might have been discharged. And we also get the lists of discharges. So it's important to look for when your ancestor might have been charged, convicted, and sentenced and actually entered into the prison. But when were they discharged? And we'll look also at what are the circumstances of their discharge. So just like the previous records, we are looking at the same prison, so the records are of a very similar format where we get their names, their dates, the crimes, the sentences that they endured, when they entered, what their nativity was, age, trade, whether they were commuted, paroled, their marital status, whether their parents were living or deceased. Did they have any children? And interestingly, what their religion might have been, and the status of their health. Were they in good health when they are being discharged? These Idaho records are some of the oldest prison records that are recorded on Ancestry and have some very, very valuable information. They are in folders, and in some cases there aren't very many, but it does give you a full accounting of the person's incarceration. We see first the photos. And we actually get a description of the convict. Mr. Anderson is from Idaho, and he is charged with forgery. He is going to get a 1-year sentence. He is 40 years old. And we note that he was born in Illinois. So here again, this is 1908. So he has migrated across country. We get his mother's name. And one of the interesting things down at the bottom, we see his shoe size. And because he has pled guilty of the charges, we do not get a significant amount of additional information about him. We also see, this is from Washington State, and I believe it's from the 1924-ish. I don't see the date right off, but we get the pictures, what the person's name is, what their occupation was, and what their criminal occupation was. He was a burglar, and his regular occupation was also a burglar. And we get other side remarks telling us about the person. Both of these gentlemen also had aliases. They were going by other names. And we get their age and a physical description. More recently, as late as the 1960s, we get similar information. Federal prisons. The U.S. penitentiaries have the highest security. And there are also here again gradations. We have the penitentiaries, we have simply correctional institutions, which for the most part are either minimum or low security. And prisons can be either administered by the federal government or they may be privatized. There is also a federal prisoner camp, which is minimum security. And most of these records are not available through Ancestry, but are available through the states or through the actual prison itself. There are some indexes available. So I'm going to pause here for an actual longer second so that if you want to print this screen or copy down the information or do a screen capture in some way to get this web address, it gives you the information on how to locate a federal inmate that has served their sentence. It's called an inmate locator, and there are two ways in which you can look up the information. And we'll look at both of those. You can do a name search, and then once you get the inmate number, you can then look for information, and at least it will confirm whether someone of the particular name you are looking for has been convicted and sentenced to a federal prison. So by entering a name, for example, I just simply tried Smiths, and we see various Smiths, and we get that register number. That's the other way in which you can look up the information if you have the register number. And it shows their age, their race, their sex, and when they were released. And by the same token, you can look up that register number. This is from Ancestry, and it is for I guess California. I mean, my screen is covered up. And we've got their inmate numbers, et cetera. However, this is just an index. It does not give you the actual information. It's simply an index of birth dates, death dates, and when they were received. And I thought it was from Alcatraz, and I do see in reading the thing, it is for Alcatraz. The National Archives also does have a listing for the inmates at Alcatraz. It is the National Archives website is much more difficult to navigate. And since Ancestry does at least have the initial records, I would go there first. But the National Archives does have the records, and you can write for them. Here, for example, on the National Archives is a partial listing of some of the prisoners. So we talked about people serving their time, and there are also, how did they obtain their release? Were they pardoned? Were they paroled? Or was their sentence commuted? And the three different terms do have slightly different definitions. A pardon provides relief from the punishment, and it does restore certain civic rights, whereas parole is a conditional release prior to their completing of their sentence, and their rights may not be restored. Commutation is a reduction for people serving a sentence or the lowering of the level of the punishment. So they sound very similar, but we will see a couple of differences. This is a newspaper article. So if you did have someone that was imprisoned, you might look for a pardon, parole, or a commutation. These lists were regularly published. They were done on a quarterly basis when they were sent to the pardons or parole boards, or to a governor. A commutation can come from a governor or the president. So we see here from the newspaper a list of pardons, what the person's name, what their crime was, what their sentence was, what the term that they were supposed to serve, and the pardon when they actually received the pardon. So we're seeing people for the most part in shorter terms. We look at George Woods, the second one here. His crime was burglary. He was sentenced in December of 1894, and his term was supposed to be 29 years, but he was pardoned in February of 97. So he hadn't even spent 3 years in prison and was being pardoned. So that's why I said it was surprising that some of these sentences actually were turned into very low time. So speaking of pardons, the pardon can be granted by the governor or the president. They can be full, partial, absolute, or conditional. And do they absolve the person of the crime? A full pardon does. A partial only receives some of those. And an absolute is granted without any conditions whatsoever. And conditional pardons obviously rely on some form of condition that must be met. Pardons do not clear the criminal record, but they do restore the right to vote. I was surprised that a person could hold a public office even after being tried convicted, and eventually pardoned. They can serve on a jury, and they can possess a firearm. Here is another newspaper listing in Indiana, and we have pardons recommended, paroles recommended, clemency. So we get these listings and we see the names, what their crimes were, what their sentences are, and a recommendation at this point. Some prison systems also do maintain parole registers. And as we have seen before, we get various columns of information. We get their names, we get their dates, the maximum and minimum sentences, the dates that those maximum and minimum sentences apply, and the actual parole date. Did they serve their whole sentence, part of their sentence, and what kind of parole did they get? We also see when their parole ended and to whom they were paroled and that person's address. Similarly, there are some that received what are called indefinite sentences. I don't understand the difference here, but we do see when they were sentenced, when they're, or what the minimum and maximum time of their sentence is going to be. And then we see a number of days that I assume they actually served. This one to me involves further investigation. I think that what it means, my conjecture is that these people were in Auburn and then were sent to other prisons in other areas of the state to fulfill their imprisonment. By the same token, we also have listings of commutations. We have the names, the court in which they were tried and sentenced, the name of the judge, and the date. And we get the date that they were received, their term, when their commutation was earned, when they were discharged, and interestingly, the shop that they worked in. So we see within the prison system that there were different forms of occupations that people were, jobs that they were assigned to, and perhaps received some training. Finally, we go backwards a little bit and we look at court costs. This one happens to be from 1881 in Tennessee. And we have Jacob Kyle, and he is charged with the killing of Jefferson Anderson on the 19th day of March in 1881. He was found guilty as charged and is in default of bail, and he is confined to the city jail. So not only is he incurring a prison sentence, but he is also going to receive a bill for the various costs. And this is one of those cases where we have the records of the list of people that might have given evidence against. So they are going to be paid for their services. And many of these people gave simply a day, and he is going to be charged with 50 cents for each one of those people who either appeared as witnesses and might have been, I doubt that this is for jury duty, but he's incurred an additional $10 in his costs. So he's got time to serve and he's got money to pay. So we see where it doesn't pay to go on the other side of the law. There is a website called Black Sheep Ancestors, and they do have some extracted information about prisons, persons in prisons, and their prison records. We don't want to forget women. While most of what we've seen has been men, we did see one or two women. We also see here again in Canyon City, we see a woman who is going to prison and is in prison. And we see that Electra Beard from newspaper articles was convicted of embezzlement of the funds of the Children's Hospital Association. And she was taken to the penitentiary on Monday. As a follow-up, she used the money to pay the mortgage on her house. However, when she was convicted, the Children's Hospital Association was able to sell the house, and they recouped some of the money that she had embezzled from them. And she even got her picture in the paper. And my question is that a hat or is that her hair? So, but she actually spent time here in Canyon City, and her records are here. So, looking beyond, I've talked about the actual prison records and how very few of them are readily available through Ancestry or Family Search. Look at newspapers to see if you can find the surrounding information about the crimes that someone is suspected of. Look at the county courthouse also. In the area where your ancestor might have lived. They do have jail records. They do have the trial records, and they might have any records of name changes. We saw several of the people that had aliases, so there might be some records that are under name changes. State archives, prison museums and prison archives, the State Department of Corrections may provide the information for you. And as we saw with that lookup, there's also the Bureau of Prisons that can help. And look at all the associated names. There are those of the names of, we've seen arresting officers, the sheriffs, marshals, and police that might have been involved in a person's arrest and subsequent trial and sentencing. Who were the witnesses in the crime, either for or against the plaintiff? Who were the attorneys and who were the judges? And if any of your people were involved, even on the right, especially on the right side of the law, what would their influence have been? And what are some of the categories of information that you could add additional information about your person? So with that, I will open it to any questions or comments.
Okay, Terri, I have experience with my own family that they had a case that went to the Oklahoma Supreme Court. And on the internet, I can actually download the proceedings of those cases. And actually, my grandfather was a witness. And to see his words and learn more about him through what was testified.
So, yes. My one comment to that is that was a civil case. It was not a criminal case. So there was no jail or prison time involved. However, if you do have relatives that were somehow involved in civil cases, those records are equally available through various state sites. In my own personal case, what got me interested in this particular topic was in 1851, I had one of my French Canadian relatives, not a direct line ancestor, but one that's on the side and still very much in the family. In 1851, she was arrested, tried, and convicted for the murder by poisoning of her husband's first wife. Both she was a mere 16 years old when this 40-year-old man had his eye on her. And he's the one that convinced her to help poison his first wife so that he could then marry her. So he was kind of a dirty old man, and she just went along with it. And while the information is in French, the whole transcript of their trial is available, and it is online. Actually, through archive.org, a book website. So that's how I got interested in women in prison. Her death sentence was commuted, and I have not been able to find any records where she actually served prison time. I know that approximately 3 years after her commutation, or it was commuted to life in prison, I know approximately 3 years after that, she married someone else and went on to have 3 children. So more digging has to be done.
What a juicy story. So I have a few comments, but before I get into that, I just want to encourage everybody, we still have time to answer questions. So if you have any questions, if you have any comments, something of your own finding to share, we do love to hear from you. So go ahead and drop it in the chat at this time. There's the little chat bubble should be at the bottom of your screen. Just click on that. It works like similar to like an email or text message, and we'll be able to see your comments. So much good stuff, Terri. One of the things kind of you started right off with was looking at the other side of it, the law enforcement or the criminal justice side. And that's not something that I would have thought of. So that's a good tip. What was interesting about the detained witnesses that just kind of piqued my curiosity. I want to look at that a little bit more. But I wanted to ask you, you had referenced the 1920 census. How would you go about accessing that? Is there a certain area within the census that is for prison records?
There is not a separate area within the census for prison records. However, through Ancestry especially, there is the opportunity to enter a keyword in the search. So even without a name, if you know that somebody was in a particular state, or suspected to be in a particular state, you can look for Colorado and a census year and put in that keyword prison, and you will get prison records. By the same token, you can do the same thing with jail and other search terms. So I believe on state censuses, there are some separate records for, I know poorhouses and almshouses have separate records. And I think in those cases, in state census records, prisons may also be called out in a separate schedule.
Thank you. That's interesting. So you just kind of put in the name or that search term, and then it would show up alphabetically, just like everybody else. And
Yeah.
what would it be under, like, instead of occupation, would that show they were incarcerated or something, some of the notes there?
It depends on where it is located
address.
in the sense where the word prison is located in the actual census record. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you. So thank you all for attending today. We always appreciate your support. We hope to see you at the next genealogy, September 9th. And just a few more things. Come down and see us at the museum, 612 Royal Gorge Boulevard. We're open Wednesdays to Saturdays, 10 to 4. As always, keep an eye on our website, museum.canyoncity.org. And in light of today's topic, if you haven't been over to the prison museum here in town, or if you have, head over there and check it out. It's a really neat museum. Museum director Stacy Klein does a great job. She's really interesting to talk to, as well as the rest of her staff. And they have a lot of really cool information. So thank you.